to leave a message for James and the brothers. Well, that would confuse even the most knowledgeable person, because how could James, the only James we've met, be removed? And the next thing we hear, leave a message for James and the brothers. Why would Peter be leaving a message for James and the brothers at the house of someone called Mary, the mother of John Mark? There's a lot of obfuscation going on here. If you're going to the house of some Mary to leave a message for James, it's most likely Mary, the mother of James. So we're getting substitutions occurring here. Plus, the real James, the leader of the early church, is being introduced here in his real position, but we've never been told in Acts previously who this James was. He just appears willy-nilly out of nowhere. But notice it's in the same chapter that the other James is removed conveniently. I, in my work, say this is not James, the brother of the sword that was James, brother of John, that was beheaded. It is the brother of somebody. That probably is true. But I would assume it's Theudas who was beheaded. That's the person Josephus likes to categorize all the beheadings of this period. And I would assume that Theudas is the third brother of Jesus, called Judas, the brother of Jesus. Theudas. And he was trying to be a second Jesus. He may have even been the twin of Jesus. And that's what I think Acts is covering over, because it doesn't want to tell us about the other James. It never told us in the beginning about him, and it still doesn't tell us here. Now that may not be true. It's an alternate theory. I'm entitled to my theories. The book of Acts is entitled to its. Since you said, why don't you give as much attention to the book of Acts theory? Well, I think the book of Acts theory has received sufficient attention for the last 20 centuries. I don't need to give it any more. It's had the attention of about 50 billion people. Occasionally, one or two people come along who have a different view, and then you can evaluate what you think about it. So the book of Acts view of things, it's all here in Eusebius. It's accepted directly here. It's all presented and familiar to everybody, and the only thing that isn't familiar are some of the things that we're bringing up. So that is what helps people decide for themselves if they think there are some other materials that should be inspected and considered, and I'm trying to do that. So right away we have James not being mentioned in Acts until that point there, and the key here in the early church testimonies, that I accept that, is that James somehow got to be leader of the early church very early on. Some say directly after the death of Jesus or his ascension, or however you want to put it, and that's not covered in Acts. But there is an election covered, the election to replace the 12th apostle, as if this was an important event. It's not an important event, because the 12th apostle is not important, and we never hear from the people who replaced him ever again in Christian history. So how is that an important event? I think Acts has taken a trivial event, if it even occurred, and replaced an important event. That is, the election of James has been rubbed out in favor of the election of Judas Iscariot, which has been substituted. And of course, its general aim of anti-Semitism has been furthered by that particular substitution. The substitution, by the way, does not agree with the presentation of the death of Judas in Matthew. Matthew is the only gospel that gives the death of Judas, and according to Matthew, how did Judas die? He hung himself in a suicide. In Acts, he runs to a field that he bought with ill-gotten gains, and his belly bursts open, and he falls headlong down. If you look at all of the material from the death of James and early church fathers, you'll find those elements there, that they hit James's head with a club and his brains burst out of his head, much like Judas's belly bursts open and James falls from the pinnacle of the temple. Prior to that, headlong, as we'll see in the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, Judas Iscariot falls headlong in the Akoldema, the so-called field blood. So we have a lot of overlap there too. So I think just like you have residual elements, if you look at it carefully and you use your head, you can begin to see the real history underlying the more literary history, shall we say, of the time. Now maybe we have the real history, but the real history doesn't agree then. Did Judas Iscariot fall headlong in the field of blood and his guts burst open, or did he hang himself? So right away we have a total contradiction. So I don't know what the real history is in that case. Yeah?
That is reminiscent, the death of Judas, reminiscent of a few other Old Testament figures that there are different death accounts as far as like historically what really happened and then what's accounted in the scripture, the Jewish scriptures on their death. And
well, I wouldn't use the Hebrew scripture as any model of perspicuity. In other words, just because you have contradictory material in the Hebrew scripture doesn't excuse it in any other place. It's inexcusable in Hebrew scripture and in this.
Well, what I would imply is that perhaps a literary device, a way of explaining in a faith-based, I guess, vocabulary that what their lives were about was unacceptable, and then they present this way of death that, you know, seems so horrible. It talks about the guts.
I'm just trying to get the history of this. We know that James died with his, according to the early church accounts, I'm not sure they're correct, with his guts or his head being burst open, and we have a similar parallel in the Judas thing. I'm going to show there's lots of overlaps in the presentation of Judas with the life of James. One overlap is the election of his supposed successor. What we should be having here is the election of the successor to Jesus, not the election of the successor. That's what's called for at this point. And the early church fathers tell us that's what occurred, but it's missing from Acts in place of this. So I'm just showing the weaknesses in the Judas Iscariot event. And the second part of that Judas Iscariot event, yeah, it does serve a great purpose. It increases anti-Semitism. So Judas has become a byname for horrific behavior. And people say, you Judas, almost like they say, you Jew. And it has actually served its purpose for 2,000 years. And a good, compassionate Christian would begin to realize that this is very, not just libelous is the wrong word, material that incites people with negative feelings and even hatred verging on murderousness. So I think the Judas Iscariot character is not someone that we should reinforce, but someone that we should try, in fact, to explain away, if at all possible, because the harm engendered by that portrayal has been, you know, monumental is all I can tell you, monumental. And it still is today when people talk about you Judas as if that is the epitome of a traitor. To use the most holy name among Jews as the epitome of being a traitor is, I think, a slur on Jewish people, and which contributes to Holocaust. Now, if preachers didn't tell you this, therefore it's good to take classes like this, because someone should tell good and decent believing Christian these things, because I know good and decent believing Christians would want to do something about it.